It began, as many stories in St. Mary Mead do, with something that at first seemed perfectly ordinary. The quiet village had always held its share of peculiarities: neighbors who whispered behind hedges, sudden scandals about missing pies or garden disputes, and the occasional small excitement of an unexpected visitor. But rarely did the village stir with the kind of curiosity that an old bookshop could provoke. Lady Bantry, ever the source of village chatter, had discovered that the abandoned shop at the corner of High Street, once run by the reclusive Mr. Fletcher, was finally to be reopened. For months the dusty windows had displayed nothing but fading book covers, their pages curled and yellowed with neglect. Now word spread that someone mysterious had purchased the property. Who, precisely, no one seemed to know. Naturally, curiosity spread faster than the Morning Post. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it must be a Londoner, looking for a retirement hobby. The vicar's wife insisted it was a collector of rare books, hoping to profit off the unsuspecting villagers. And, of course, there were darker whispers about how Fletcher's death had never seemed quite right, how his sudden passing left questions unanswered, and how his belongings had been packed away with unusual haste. At first glance, none of this seemed to trouble Miss Jane Marple. Sitting in her small, rose-covered cottage, she listened politely to each theory as neighbors popped in for tea. She nodded at their gossip, offered her gentle observations, and busied her hands with her knitting. To an untrained eye, she seemed barely interested. But as anyone who truly knew her could attest, Miss Marple had a way of seeing connections that others missed. On the morning of the reopening, a small crowd gathered outside the bookshop. The sign above the door had been freshly painted, though curiously the shop retained its old name: Fletcher's Fine Books. The owner, a quiet, stooping man in a dark coat, appeared with little ceremony, turning the key and inviting people inside. He introduced himself as Mr. Arkwright, though he gave away very little else. The villagers wandered through the narrow aisles, brushing dust from long-forgotten shelves. Many of the books were ordinary: romance paperbacks, travel guides, histories of England. But tucked in corners were stranger volumes, the kind of works one rarely saw in such a small village: journals with handwritten notes in the margins, obscure treatises on codes and ciphers, and even a locked wooden box filled with brittle old letters. For most, this was nothing more than eccentric clutter. But to Miss Marple, who stood quietly at the back of the shop, something felt decidedly off. She noticed the way Arkwright hovered near the back shelves, watching certain customers more carefully than others. She observed how some books seemed to have been deliberately placed to catch attention, while others were hidden away as though meant to remain unseen. It was later that week when the first real disturbance came. Mrs. Lestrange, one of the newer residents of the village, had purchased a book from the shop, a faded green volume with no title on the spine. She carried it home, wrapped in brown paper, and thought little of it. But that very evening, her home was broken into. Nothing else was taken. Only the book was gone. This, naturally, set the entire village aflame with speculation. Burglary in St. Mary Mead was unusual enough. But burglary, where the only item stolen was an obscure old book? That was positively unheard of. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, merely folded her knitting and sat quietly in thought. She remembered the way Arkwright had watched Mrs. Lestrange as she carried that particular book to the counter. She recalled the faint flicker of alarm in his eyes, quickly masked by a forced smile, and she could not help but wonder, was it possible that Mr. Arkwright had opened the shop not to sell books, but to find something hidden among them? Something worth breaking into a house to retrieve? The gossip deepened when whispers emerged about Fletcher's past. It was said he had once traveled widely across Europe, bringing back not only books but strange acquaintances. Some remembered visitors who spoke in hushed tones, men who never gave their names, and packages that arrived late at night. No one had thought much of it at the time, dismissing Fletcher as merely eccentric. But now, those memories resurfaced with new weight. In the midst of all this, Arkwright maintained his quiet, watchful presence. He spoke little, sold books with politeness but no warmth, and seemed to vanish from the village the moment his shop closed for the day. His movements were discreet, yet not discreet enough for Miss Marple's observant eyes. She noted when he left after dark, which paths he took, and how often he lingered at the post office to collect envelopes he never opened in public. By the end of that week, the once sleepy village of St. Mary Mead was alive with tension. Something about the bookshop had unsettled the balance. People began locking their doors more carefully, casting suspicious glances at strangers, and speculating endlessly about what, exactly, lay hidden among Fletcher's old collection. And though no one else could quite articulate why, many felt a quiet sense of reassurance knowing that Miss Marple was watching, for she had a way of noticing the tiniest of details, and in those details she often found the truth. But this time, Miss Marple sensed something more dangerous than the ordinary. Village squabble. This time, the clues hinted at secrets long buried, secrets people might kill to protect. The Sunday calm of St. Mary Mead was deceptive. To the casual visitor, the village seemed unchanged. Cottages gleamed in the late summer light, roses spilled over stone walls, and the parishioners filed dutifully into church. Yet beneath this quiet surface, the air was thick with speculation. The burglary at Mrs. Lestrange's home had lodged itself into every conversation, and the name Arkwright was whispered with unease. Neighbors exchanged theories over garden fences, and after the church service, leaning closer as though afraid their words might be overheard. Some declared the man harmless, merely a peculiar book dealer who had arrived in the wrong sort of village. Others insisted he had brought trouble with him, and that his purchase of the old shop had been no coincidence. But all agreed on one point: the timing of Mrs. Lestrange's theft was far too suspicious. Miss Marple, as ever, observed without rushing to judgment. She knew better than to draw conclusions from gossip alone, yet she could not ignore the pattern forming in her mind. The vanished book was no random trinket. Someone had wanted it enough to break into a house, and the question was, who? The following days brought further strangeness. Two villagers, Mrs. Price Ridley and Colonel Melchett's nephew, reported seeing a stranger lurking near High Street after dark. Descriptions varied. One claimed he was tall and thin, another insisted short and broad, but both agreed the figure had moved with deliberate purpose, pausing near the bookshop before vanishing down an alley. The next morning, Arkwright was seen sweeping outside his shop earlier than usual, his expression tense, as though he had not slept. The gossip thickened into suspicion, and suspicion soon hardened into fear. Villagers began avoiding the shop altogether, crossing the street rather than walk past its darkened windows. Arkwright noticed, of course, but he gave no sign of caring. He remained behind his counter, sorting books with his thin, pale hands, as though the world outside mattered not at all. Miss Marple, however, decided upon a quiet inspection. With the practiced air of an elderly lady with nothing more than idle interest, she entered the shop one morning, carrying her small handbag and her usual smile. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with dust and secrets. The shelves were still lined with their peculiar mix of ordinary novels and strange scholarly works. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes lingered on the gaps, spaces where books had been removed, not by browsing customers but with careful, deliberate hands. It was then she noticed a locked glass cabinet tucked against the back wall. Inside lay several leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked with age. Each bore symbols rather than titles, symbols Miss Marple faintly recognized from her younger days reading about codes used in wartime. She remembered Fletcher, too, and his curious visitors who had spoken with foreign accents and carried themselves with an air of secrecy. Her thoughts were interrupted when Arkwright appeared silently at her side, as though he had been watching her all along. He offered his usual thin smile, polite but strained, and inquired whether she sought anything in particular. Miss Marple replied with her gentle vagueness, speaking of novels and pastimes, but her mind worked rapidly. She noticed the way his hand lingered on the key to the cabinet, the way his gaze flickered briefly to the very shelf Mrs. Lestrange's stolen book had once occupied. Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire knitting, she pieced together what she had seen. Fletcher, eccentric though he had not merely been a collector of books. There had been purpose behind his acquisitions, purpose hidden beneath the appearance of quaint village eccentricity. And now Arkwright had arrived, stepping into Fletcher's shadow, searching perhaps for something Fletcher had left behind. The next disturbance came swiftly. A farmhand reported seeing two men arguing outside the bookshop after midnight. One was Arkwright, recognizable by his hunched figure and dark coat. The other was unknown, described only as forceful and impatient. The farmhand, not wishing to be caught, had hurried away, but he was certain he had heard mention of a letter and something about the wrong book. By morning, the rumor had spread across the village, twisted into ever more elaborate tales. Some said Arkwright was part of a smuggling ring, using the shop as cover. Others believed he hunted treasure hidden in one of Fletcher's volumes. A few, more imaginative still, claimed Fletcher had been a spy during the war and that his secrets were now surfacing. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained calm, but her suspicions sharpened. The mention of a letter intrigued her most. She remembered seeing a small wooden box in the shop, filled with old correspondence. It seemed possible that not just books, but letters, too, held value. Value enough to drive men into quarrels and burglaries. Events soon escalated when a second theft occurred. This time, the victim was Mr. Badger, the village postmaster. His house was ransacked, though again little of material worth was taken. The only missing item was a parcel Fletcher had mailed years ago but never collected. An unremarkable package, stored away and recently brought home by Mr. Badger when the post office had cleared its shelves. Its contents were unknown, but its disappearance spoke volumes. The village now buzzed with unease. 2 burglaries in as many weeks, both targeting. Relics connected to Fletcher's old shop could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And through it all, Arkwright continued his silent routines, drawing suspicion with every step he took. Miss Marple, however, was less interested in the obvious suspect. She knew from long experience that true culprits often hid behind the appearance of guilt. Arkwright might be involved, but she suspected another hand was at work, someone watching the village closely, someone who understood Fletcher's past as more than idle eccentricity. By now, Miss Marple's curiosity had deepened into quiet resolve. She began to make her own discreet inquiries, asking casual questions that seemed innocent enough. She spoke to villagers about Fletcher's visitors from years past, piecing together descriptions. She examined old parish records, noting the dates of Fletcher's travels abroad. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Fletcher had not merely been a bookseller but a keeper of secrets, his shop a quiet front for something larger. The question remained, what had he hidden, and why were people now so desperate to retrieve it? As dusk fell on another unsettled day, Miss Marple looked out from her cottage window toward the dimly lit bookshop. Its windows glowed faintly, a solitary beacon on the high street. She sensed that events were building toward something more, dangerous, something that would place not just Arkwright but the entire village in peril. And so, with her knitting needles clicking steadily in her hands, Miss Marple prepared herself for what was to come. For mysteries, once awakened, had a way of unraveling, and this one had only just begun to reveal its threads. By the 3rd week, the village had transformed into something it had never been before, a place humming with unease. Once, the greatest scandal was whether Mrs. Price Ridley's begonias had won fairly at the flower show, or whether Colonel Melchett's nephew had been seen lingering too long at the pub. But now, St. Mary Mead was gripped by something darker. 2 burglaries, strange arguments in the dead of night, and the persistent shadow of Fletcher's old shop had turned idle gossip into genuine fear. The unease showed in small ways. Villagers began keeping their curtains drawn after dusk, as though hiding themselves from unseen watchers. The church saw more visitors than usual during the week, not out of sudden piety, but out of nervous habit. Locks were checked and double-checked, and even the vicar's wife admitted she no longer walked alone past the bookshop in the evenings. Miss Marple, however, noticed more than fear. She noticed patterns. She noticed how the burglaries had targeted not valuables but remnants of Fletcher's collection. She noticed how Arkwright's nervous glances seemed directed less at the villagers and more toward the unseen presence she herself suspected. And she noticed, above all, the curious silence that hung over Mrs. Lestrange, the very woman whose book had been stolen first. Mrs. Lestrange had been unusually quiet since the burglary. She did not join in the gossip, nor did she complain of her loss beyond the initial shock. She carried herself with a reserve that was out of place in a village where every scrap of news was aired in public. Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to recognize the signs of someone with something to hide, made note of this. Her suspicions were sharpened when a small discovery was made. A local boy, Tom Andrews, while playing near the edge of the common, stumbled upon torn pages scattered in the grass. The paper was brittle and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. Miss Marple was called to inspect them, under the pretense of her fondness for old books. The pages, as she quickly realized, belonged to no ordinary novel. They were fragments of correspondence, written in a careful hand, mixing English with coded phrases in French and German. The boy had found perhaps a dozen pages, torn roughly from a larger volume, but Miss Marple noted with interest that the green binding fragments matched the very book Mrs. Lestrange had purchased and then lost to the burglar. This discovery changed everything. The stolen book had not been of value for its cover, but for its contents. A hidden collection of coded letters bound to resemble an ordinary volume. Whoever had wanted it so desperately had succeeded in reclaiming it, but not before some of its secrets were scattered into the grass for anyone sharp-eyed enough to notice. Miss Marple quietly gathered the fragments, taking them home under the pretense of tidying up litter. That evening, by lamplight, she spread them across her table and began to piece them together. She could not fully decipher the coded phrases, but she recognized enough to confirm her suspicions. These were not love letters, as some might guess, but correspondences of a more serious nature. They referenced locations, names concealed behind initials, and phrases that hinted at wartime espionage. Fletcher, it seemed, had not been simply eccentric. He had been involved in something far larger, something that had now reached out from the past to trouble St. Mary Mead. While Miss Marple examined her fragments, the village was once again stirred by events at the bookshop. Late one night a lantern was seen glowing in the upper windows, though Arkwright never admitted to staying. Overnight, 2 villagers swore they heard the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. By morning, the shop's doorframe bore fresh scratches, as though someone had forced their way inside, or had tried to force their way out. The next day, Arkwright appeared haggard, his clothes rumpled and his demeanor more agitated than ever. He snapped at a customer, an unheard-of breach of politeness, and later was seen pacing outside the post office, clutching a sealed envelope with a trembling hand. Miss Marple observed all this with her usual calm. She knew desperation when she saw it. Arkwright was under pressure, and not just from the villagers' suspicion. Someone was pulling strings, pressing him into actions that frayed his composure, and she knew, too, that desperate men often made mistakes. It was during this time that Miss Marple's quiet inquiries began to bear fruit. A retired colonel from the neighboring village recalled Fletcher entertaining a group of foreign gentlemen during the late 1930s before the war. A former maid from Fletcher's household remembered odd packages arriving by courier, never to be opened in her presence. And an elderly clerk from London, who had once catalogued Fletcher's purchases, confirmed that many of the books he acquired were rare volumes tied to codes, ciphers, and political histories. Piece by piece, the picture formed. Fletcher had been a man enmeshed in secrets. his bookshop a convenient mask for dealings of a more dangerous kind. The items now resurfacing, the green-bound book, the mysterious parcel, the letters, were fragments of that hidden past. But who sought them now? Arkwright's role remained unclear. Was he a mere errand runner, dispatched to sift through Fletcher's legacy? Or was he himself one of those who had once walked in Fletcher's shadow, returned now to claim what had been left unfinished? Miss Marple knew the answer would not reveal itself through speculation alone. It would reveal itself, as it so often did, through patience, observation, and the quiet unraveling of human behavior. Her patience was soon rewarded. That very week, she saw Mrs. Lestrange slip quietly into the bookshop at dusk, long after its usual closing time. No one else seemed to notice, but Miss Marple did. She also noticed that Mrs. Lestrange remained inside for nearly an hour before, departing, her face pale and her movements quick as though she wished not to be seen. The next morning, a rumor spread that Mrs. Lestrange had fallen ill during the night, though no doctor had been called. And though the village gossips clucked their tongues with concern, Miss Marple wondered whether her illness was not of the body, but of the conscience. The fragments of the letters, the midnight visitors, the stolen book, everything was beginning to converge. Miss Marple sensed that the secret hidden within Fletcher's collection was nearing exposure. And she knew, with the certainty that came from years of watching human folly unfold, that exposure would not come without danger. The village, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering in its midst, carried on with its small routines. But Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles steady in her hands, and kept her watch. For the bookshop's secret was tightening its hold, and soon St. Mary Mead would find itself entangled in a mystery far larger than any village scandal. The tension in St. Mary Mead could no longer be mistaken for idle curiosity. What had begun as murmurs about a new shopkeeper had escalated into a pervasive unease that settled over the village like a mist. It was no longer merely gossip whispered behind lace curtains. It was fear that crept into daily life, unspoken, but unmistakable. The villagers avoided Fletcher's old bookshop entirely now. Where once there had been eager curiosity, now there was only suspicion. The door remained open, the bell above it chiming hopefully, but customers were few. The children who had once pressed their noses to the window now crossed the street with their mothers, hurried along with scolding words about not staring. Arkwright himself appeared more gaunt with each passing day, pacing behind the counter like a man caught in a trap. Miss Marple, with her usual quiet persistence, continued to observe. She saw how Arkwright lingered over the locked cabinet of books as though debating whether to open it. She noted his frequent trips to the post office, always leaving with a sealed envelope but never sending one out. And she observed Mrs. Lestrange, whose pale face and nervous glances betrayed an anxiety she tried to hide. Then, one evening, the calm of the village was broken in earnest. The constable was summoned to the high street after shouts were heard near the bookshop. A lantern had been smashed, its glass glittering across the cobbles, and a dark stain marked the ground where someone had fallen. By the time villagers rushed out, the street was empty. Only the broken lantern remained, and the faint sound of hurried footsteps fading into the night. The incident shook St. Mary Mead. For the first time, whispers turned to outright fear. What was happening in their quiet village? Who was prowling the high street after dark? And why did every disturbance seem to circle back to that cursed bookshop? The next morning, Arkwright appeared with a bandage on his hand. He claimed it was a simple accident with a stack of books, but few believed him. His evasive answers only deepened suspicion. Some declared he had been attacked. Others believed he had been the attacker. Either way, the shop's shadow grew darker. Miss Marple, however, was not distracted by appearances. She had gathered enough fragments of the coded letters to sense their importance, though their full meaning eluded her. She also knew, with the intuition that came from decades of quiet observation, that Mrs. Lestrange was not merely a bystander. The woman's visit to the shop after hours, her sudden illness, and her strained silence all pointed to knowledge she was unwilling or afraid to share. Events took a sharper turn when the vicar's maid reported seeing a stranger near the churchyard at dawn. He was described as foreign-looking, with a sharp face and a heavy coat, and he carried himself with the restless energy of a man on watch. The maid, frightened, had scurried away, but her description spread quickly through the village. It was no longer just Arkwright who drew suspicion. Now there was the specter of outsiders, intruders with unknown motives. Miss Marple quietly considered the pattern. Fletcher's coded letters hidden in books, a parcel stolen from the postmaster's home, Arkwright's furtive behavior, Mrs. Lestrange's nervous secrecy, and now strangers appearing in the village at odd hours. The threads were tightening, weaving into something larger than any villager dared imagine. The answer began to take form one afternoon when Miss Marple paid a polite call on Mrs. Lestrange. She found the woman pale, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the tea. The conversation was carefully ordinary, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the small details others would miss. The faint smell of dust and ink clinging to Mrs. Lestrange's cuffs, the nervous way she touched the side-table drawer, and the stack of papers half concealed beneath a scarf. When she departed, Miss Marple carried with her not just the taste of weak tea, but the certainty that Mrs. Lestrange possessed something connected to Fletcher's secrets. The question was whether she was guarding it willingly, or whether she was caught in the same web as Arkwright. That night another disturbance confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. A scream was heard near the lane leading to Mrs. Lestrange's house. Villagers rushed to their windows but saw only shadows fleeing into the dark. By morning, it was revealed that Mrs. Lestrange's home had been searched again. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled open, yet once more nothing obvious was taken. But Miss Marple noticed the difference. Unlike the earlier burglary, this time the search had been hurried, almost reckless. Whoever sought Fletcher's secrets was growing desperate, willing to risk exposure to find what they sought. The following day, a discovery startled the village. A farmhand, the same boy who had found the torn pages, uncovered a leather satchel hidden in a hedge near the railway line. Inside were more pages, letters written in Fletcher's hand, some coded and some plain. They spoke vaguely of meetings in London, of deliveries and watchers, and of a final task left unfinished. The satchel was handed over to the constable, who, uncertain of its meaning, placed it in his office. But Miss Marple quietly committed every word she had seen to memory. Fletcher's work had not ended with his death. It had been left behind, scattered in books and letters, waiting for those who knew to come searching. Now they had come. Arkwright was not alone. Others had entered St. Mary Mead, prowling its lanes and watching its residents, intent on retrieving what Fletcher had hidden. The villagers grew restless, some demanding the bookshop be shut down entirely, others urging the authorities to intervene. But Miss Marple knew that official measures would do little against forces that thrived in secrecy. She also knew that the heart of the mystery lay not in London, nor in distant conspiracies, but right there in the village. The answer, as always, was closer than anyone suspected. One evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by her fire, she laid out the facts in her mind. Arkwright searching, Mrs. Lestrange hiding, Fletcher's past resurfacing, strangers circling, and the village caught unwittingly in the middle. It was a pattern she had seen before in smaller dramas, the greed of some, the fear of others, and the secrets that bound them all together. But this time, the stakes were higher, for secrets written in code were not the idle trifles of gossip. They were matters men might kill for. And Miss Marple, calm as ever, prepared herself. She knew the breaking point was coming soon. The village of St. Mary Mead was no stranger to scandal, but what unfolded in the days that followed marked a change in its very character. What had once been a quaint countryside community, with its Hedgerows and garden teas had become a stage for secrets buried decades deep. Each morning brought new whispers, each evening carried new fears, and beneath it all lay the bookshop, silent, brooding, and somehow alive with menace. Miss Marple, who appeared to do nothing more than sit by her window with her knitting, was in truth carefully gathering threads. She had long learned that people revealed more when they believed no one was paying them any mind. And what she saw now troubled her deeply. Arkwright, once merely reserved, was unraveling. His hands shook as he sorted books, his eyes darted at every sound, and he had taken to locking the shop door even during business hours, admitting only those he chose. More than once he was seen slipping out after dark, returning only near dawn. He looked less like a shopkeeper each day and more like a hunted man. Mrs. Lestrange, too, could no longer conceal her agitation. Her curtains remained drawn, her steps hurried, and her health seemed to fail beneath the strain. Neighbors brought her food, but she seldom accepted visitors. Those few who saw her remarked on her pale, hollow expression and the faint tremor in her hands. And then came the event that transformed unease into outright alarm. It was a Tuesday evening when the constable was roused by frantic knocking at his door. A fire had broken out, small but unmistakable, inside the bookshop. Villagers rushed to the high street, forming a bucket chain until the flames were subdued. Though the blaze had not spread far, the damage was plain. A shelf of books lay. Blackened, the cabinet glass shattered, and smoke poured from the upstairs rooms. Arkwright, curiously, was nowhere to be found. Some swore they had seen him earlier that evening, pacing inside the shop. Others claimed he had left hours before, but by the time the villagers stood amidst the smoke and charred paper, he had vanished completely. The absence sent ripples of fear across the village. Where had he gone? Was the fire an accident or an attempt to destroy evidence? And what, precisely, was hidden among those blackened shelves that someone might wish to burn? Miss Marple, surveying the wreckage from a quiet distance, noticed something others overlooked. Amidst the ashes lay fragments of paper not wholly consumed by flame. She stooped, gathering them discreetly. Though damaged, they bore the same coded writing she had seen before, references to deliveries, to the courier, and to a final packet. It was clear to her now. Fletcher had hidden more than just books. He had hidden documents, perhaps intelligence, smuggled through his shop in the guise of literature. That night Miss Marple pondered the fire. It had not spread wide. It had been controlled, targeted. Someone had sought to destroy something specific, yet they had failed entirely. The coded fragments survived, and in surviving, they pointed toward something larger still. A final packet Fletcher had concealed, one that Arkwright or his unseen associates were desperate to locate. The following morning brought further shock. Arkwright reappeared at the post office, weary and disheveled, claiming he had been away in London. His explanation rang hollow, but the villagers had no proof with which to challenge him. He resumed his post at the shop, though fewer than ever dared cross its threshold. But Miss Marple noticed a change in him. His fear was sharper now, his movements quicker, as though time itself were pressing upon him. He no longer sorted the shelves absent-mindedly. He rifled through them with purpose, pulling books down, scanning them, discarding them. He was searching, relentlessly, desperately searching, and then, quite suddenly, Mrs. Lestrange collapsed. She was found by her maid, unconscious on the floor, with a letter clutched in her hand. The doctor was called, and though he declared it a fainting spell, Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw more. The letter, hastily hidden by the maid, bore Fletcher's handwriting. Here, at last, the truth began to surface. Mrs. Lestrange was not merely an innocent victim of circumstance. She was involved, whether as Fletcher's confidant, his courier, or his partner in secrecy, Miss Marple could not yet say. But the connection was undeniable. The book she had purchased, the visits to the shop, the burglary, and now the letter in her hand, all tied her fate to Fletcher's unfinished business. The village, meanwhile, buzzed with wild theories. Some insisted Mrs. Lestrange had been poisoned, others that she had discovered a treasure map, and still others that she was secretly in league with Arkwright. Each tale grew taller than the last, but beneath the chatter lay genuine dread. The bookshop's shadow seemed to reach into every home now. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, pieced the fragments together. Fletcher had concealed documents, coded intelligence from his travels during the war. Arkwright had come to retrieve them, perhaps under orders, perhaps for his own ends. Mrs. Lestrange had stumbled upon, or inherited, a piece of that puzzle, making her a target. And the strangers seen near the churchyard were not random prowlers. They were watchers, drawn to St. Mary Mead by the same secrets. But there was one question Miss Marple could not yet answer. What exactly was in the final packet Fletcher had hidden? Until that answer revealed itself, the danger would only grow. That evening, as Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, a sound disturbed her thoughts. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to ears attuned to small disturbances. A footstep, hesitant, deliberate, outside her window. She did not move, did not rise, did not betray that she had noticed. But inside she knew, with quiet certainty, the web of Fletcher's secrets had drawn its hunters close. And now the danger had come directly to her own door. The footstep outside Miss Marple's cottage lingered only for a moment before retreating into the night, leaving behind silence as heavy as a closing door. But to Miss Marple, that sound was enough. It confirmed what she had long suspected. The hunt for Fletcher's secret was drawing to its end, and she herself was now under watch. The following morning dawned with deceptive calm. Birds chirped. In the hedges, children hurried to school, and the high street bustled faintly with its ordinary errands. Yet beneath this surface, unease coiled tighter. The villagers whispered that Arkwright had been seen digging behind the bookshop at dawn. Others claimed Mrs. Lestrange's condition had worsened, though the doctor refused to comment. And still others swore that the foreign-looking stranger had been spotted again, this time near the vicarage. Miss Marple, however, had reached her conclusion. The threads had all led her to one certainty. Fletcher's final packet was still in the village, hidden in a place no one had thought to look. The burglaries, the fire, the coded letters, all of it was the frantic scrambling of desperate men who knew the treasure was near but did not know precisely where. Her suspicion settled on the bookshop itself, not on its shelves or cabinets which had already been rifled through, but on the building's very bones. Fletcher, eccentric and careful, would never have trusted his secrets to the casual reach of any customer. He would have hidden them deeper. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the shop. She appeared harmless, a frail old lady with her handbag and knitting, but her eyes were sharp. Arkwright was inside, pale and exhausted, his manner restless. He scarcely greeted her, his attention fixed on the shelves he continued to dismantle. Miss Marple wandered, seemingly aimless, until she reached the back wall where the fire had blackened the plaster. There, almost hidden, she noticed something no one else had. A faint seam in the paneling, a square outline just visible beneath the soot. She traced it lightly with her finger, her suspicion confirmed. Fletcher's hiding place had been in plain sight, disguised as part of the wall. Arkwright, noticing her interest, rushed forward, his composure snapping. His voice rose, sharp with panic, though the words were lost to the thick air of dust and ash. Miss Marple, calm as ever, merely stepped aside as he tore at the panel with trembling hands. The wood gave way, revealing a cavity within. Inside lay a packet, wrapped in oilskin, untouched by fire or time. Arkwright seized it with a gasp, but before he could flee, the shop bell chimed. 2 men entered, strangers to the villagers but not to Arkwright. Their hard eyes and purposeful steps marked them for what they were, the hunters who had stalked the village in shadows. What followed unfolded with grim inevitability. Arkwright clutched the packet as the men closed in, their voices low, urgent, and threatening. He faltered, torn between fear and greed, until at last his resolve broke. He handed over Fletcher's final secret. The strangers snatched it, their satisfaction plain, and vanished as swiftly as they had appeared. The villagers, drawn by the commotion, arrived moments too late. They found only Arkwright, slumped against the counter, his face gray with defeat. The panel gaped open. The hiding place laid bare, but the prize was gone. The constable, flustered and uncertain, attempted to take charge, but Miss Marple had already seen enough. She understood what no one else did, that the packet contained documents Fletcher had hidden during the war, documents meant to protect England from enemies who would use them for harm. Now, decades later, those secrets still held power, power enough that men were willing to risk exposure to reclaim them. In the days that followed, the village slowly returned to its routines, though never quite the same. The strangers vanished, the packet gone with them, leaving only whispers of what it might have contained. Arkwright, disgraced and broken, abandoned the shop and departed without farewell. Mrs. Lestrange, weakened but alive, withdrew into seclusion, her connection to Fletcher's past never publicly spoken of again. The bookshop itself stood silent once more, its windows dark, its shelves abandoned. Some villagers declared it cursed, others claimed it should be torn down entirely. But Miss Marple knew better. It was not the building that held danger, but the secrets once hidden within. As for Miss Marple, she resumed her quiet life. She sat by her window with her knitting, listening to the hum of the village, outwardly unchanged. Yet she carried with her the knowledge of what had truly happened, that Fletcher's eccentricities had concealed a hidden world of codes and couriers, and that St. Mary Mead, in its unsuspecting quiet, had been the stage for an espionage drama. Years in the making. The villagers would gossip for years to come, their tales growing wilder with each retelling. Some would speak of treasure, others of spies, and still others of curses. But Miss Marple knew the truth. Fletcher's secret had been uncovered, claimed, and carried away, leaving behind only ashes, whispers, and an empty shop. And though the danger had passed, she remained watchful. For in her long experience she knew that secrets had a way of returning when least expected, and that human nature, with all its follies, was the greatest mystery of all.